Good afternoon, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. In fact, we had booked a smaller room hoping to fill it up, and then it's actually exactly the effect we had, so I'm glad about that. Okay, so this afternoon we're here to have a presentation from our friend Paul Barber from Australia. And this is part of the Forest Technical Network series. So we are recording this to share with other colleagues in the field and around the world. So the theme for today is healthy trees in healthy cities, innovation in urban forest management. And the idea actually started from Shiroma, who's been working with Paul on a project in Iran on boxwood blight. And we're really trying to put together the health aspect and the urban forestry aspect. I think it's important to see how we can really create synergies within the department and work together to actually have better results in the field. So Paul is going to give us a bit of an overview of what his work, what he's doing, particularly looking at how technology can help us in taking proper decisions in urban forestry management, and see how managing pests, disease in an appropriate and timely manner can actually help reduce the cost of urban forest management in the long term. So Paul is currently the Managing Director of the Arbor Carbon Limited, which is a company in Australia, I assume. And he's also adjunct professor at Murdoch University and director of the technology innovation part of Arborflight UK, which I assume works with drones. Arborflight, drones or planes or whatever. So for the last 18 months, he's actually been working with FAO in Iran, assisting on a project managed by Shiroma on boxwood blight. And his expertise is really quite wide, I think, on different pests and diseases, but also technology. So he's also supervising students, so looking at research aspects of this. And we really hope to have a good presentation from him, and we look forward to hearing what he has to tell us. So thank you very much all for joining us. I'm not sure if Doug or Fiona, you want to add any words to this, or we just start with the presentation? Just start? Okay, Paul, over to you.
Great, thanks Simone, and thank you very much for coming along and showing interest in my presentation. I've always looked at FAO from afar in terms of urban forestry and admired the work that's done. It's great to actually be here and see the group and present and have this discussion. And my experience with FAO over the last 18 months has been great with Shiroma and the project in Iran. So my first time to Rome, and I look forward to seeing a bit more of that maybe tomorrow. Okay, so my talk is about really an alternative approach to the diagnosis, monitoring and sustainable management of urban forests. And there's that connection with people as well, which is really important, I believe. And I'll present some of the work that we've done, the connection with people as well in the urban space. As Simone said, I have several roles, but my background is as a forest pathologist. That's where I came through and qualified, so diagnosing diseases in trees, and mainly forest trees and plantations, and then the last probably almost 10 years it's moved into urban forestry as well, because we often had people come to us and ask us, we have these problems in the urban area, how can we diagnose what's causing them and how can we manage them? And just given that lots of people live in cities, there's a need to manage the trees and the health of those trees. I was introduced to remote sensing in 2003 as a postdoc at Murdoch University. We started using Landsat medium resolution satellite technology to monitor changes in the landscape, so vegetation cover and greenness and health of trees. And that was my introduction. And from there it's been moving into airborne, fixed wing, more recently drones, multispectral, hyperspectral imagery, and so on. I established a company, Arbor Carbon, in 2009, just through need really for that type of service. Recently, in 2016, we set up the company in the UK called Arborflight, so we're a part of that company, and my role is Director of Technology and Innovation. So it's largely around remote sensing and airborne monitoring vegetation, and then linked to ground-based management as well. Clients include, cities, local governments, rail companies, utilities, trees near assets. And this year we've just set up a new company in Hong Kong, so I'm managing director of that. I have a role at the university, and I'm very much still linked to the university. I love the connection to the university still. I love supervising the students and seeing the innovation come into their work. And at the moment I have 3 PhD students and a master's student. So one working on Phytophthora in the urban environment, and quite a few of you I'm sure are aware of Phytophthora, which is a very serious pathogen. Another student in Vietnam working on a serious disease in acacia plantations, Rhabdocystis. I have a master's student, or a couple that I'm helping in urban remote sensing in Bang Chau in Bangkok, which is actually the Green Lung of Bangkok. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's a pretty incredible place. And more recently, a new PhD student in Australia, co-supervised with Professor Bernie Dell and Richard Harper, looking at using remote sensing for measuring biomass and carbon in urban forests. So that's a new project as well. I've been appointed to the international expert, obviously Forest Health on this project, but also the Hong Kong Urban Forest Advisory Panel, which was set up last year. It has about 15 experts from around the world. There's 2 Australians, and there's a couple of Americans and several people from Europe and so on. My sort of place on that panel is mainly around forest pathology and remote sensing, given that connection. So, and I've been to a couple of meetings so far, and it's really starting to go places. So I'm very excited about what that panel will achieve in Hong Kong, which is a pretty incredible city as well. I won't go into too much detail here because I'm sure you're all aware of the importance of urban forests in the world. But there's all these benefits, and over the years, I've often talked about, to people about trees and tree health and the importance of trees in the urban space. And you feel like you're preaching to the converted already. People are already aware of that. Often I find that we need to talk about 2 things with people who aren't the converted, and it's really money and health of people. So when it starts to affect their back pocket, their budget, or their health, then they listen. Okay, so all the other benefits come as a result of that. So we try to give that message. But really, what are the real costs and benefits of maintaining a vegetation? And I believe that the current approach in most cities in the world is unsustainable. The amount of energy and effort that goes into those trees, and then the benefits that come out of them, it's largely unbalanced. And I think we need to change that. I'll talk a bit about that through this project, through this presentation. So our very first project was in 2009. It was a golf course actually in Perth, and it's the busiest golf course in the Southern Hemisphere. It has about 150,000 rounds of golf a year. It's 36 holes. And most people think about golf courses and they think about, it's unsustainable, it's a game for the rich, and it uses a lot of water and chemicals and so on the golf course. But in fact, the golf course can be an incredible asset. And you see here, this is the golf course. This is Perth, so Perth suburbs, the northern suburbs. You have the golf course here. You have Bold Park, and if any of you have been to Perth, Kings Park just sits down here. It's an incredible botanic garden. And you can see what it is. It's this amazing green space and incredible canopy cover, and then these corridors that we can form through to wetlands. So I see that, sure, it's a game and it's management of turf, and largely can be unsustainable, but it can be an incredible green asset as well. So they were a very first client. They came to us and said, we've got these big trees, they're dying. Can you tell us why they're dying? We spend a lot of money pruning the dead wood and replacing trees each year. We want to find another way to spend that money and save the trees. So they came to us and we developed an approach. And that approach really was around diagnosing the problems, so on ground, using remote sensing. I'll show you some examples of that. Coming in and monitoring the health of those trees over time, and then treating the trees. So starting a treatment program and managing the health of those trees. And we've been doing that now. We fly over that golf course every year. So we've flown over for 8 years now. We can very precisely measure the change in cover and condition of every tree on the golf course. Okay, so I'm sure there's quite a few people who are aware of this disease decline spiral. Paul Mannion developed this in the early 1990s and late 1980s. And this is really around why trees decline, not just urban trees. So if you look here, we have this disease decline spiral. He grouped the factors that cause decline in trees into 3 major categories. You have predisposing factors. So here you have the factors like the genetics and the age, soil compaction, Even back then, climate change was listed as a predisposing factor that predisposes trees to the premature decline. And even back then, he listed the urban environment as a predisposing factor. So just the fact that trees grow in the urban environments means that they're already predisposed to premature decline. There's lots of stresses on those trees. Many of them aren't well developed to grow in the urban environment, so they're already under stress, most of them. Then we have these factors that incite decline. So things like insects and drought and diseases and pathogens and air pollution and so on. So when a tree is predisposed and a factor comes along and it incites decline, it's like a trigger. Okay, so it triggers that decline of the tree's health. I've actually listed a whole lot of other factors here that I've seen through our work over nearly the last 10 years in the urban area. These are specifically on urban trees. So these are outside this spiral, but effectively you could put these into the spiral as well, and they all play a key role. So in the urban environment, we see things like poor nursery stock it's a really big factor. So the way trees are grown, the advanced trees, if they're grown poorly, then they're planted out, they're already going to have a short life. It's really important that they're grown well. The way they're planted, the volume of soil that they're given, the quality of that soil, and matching the species to site, they're all really important, okay, to ensure longevity of those trees. Inciting factors, poor pruning, this is a big one. Really bad pruning techniques on trees allows exposed wounds, decay to come in, and problems to occur in the trees, and eventually hazards and then failure, so increased risk. Mechanical construction damage, extreme weather events, so we've seen trees absolutely hammered by hail, big hailstones, and several years later die, and then people haven't made the link back to what actually triggered that event. Pathogens and pests, chemical damage, all these factors. Sunburn is actually a really big one in Perth. Okay, so particular species are really prone to sun scald, and then it can kill the tree over time. Okay, so once a tree goes down this spiral, it's sort of hard to bring it back. Okay, and once it gets to this point, contributing factors come in and take it to the point often of no return. Okay, so it's really important that we diagnose early, we come in and mitigate early as well, so we can bring the trees back where possible to try and save them. And we do a lot of that work. And that's what I believe to be a more sustainable approach. So here just some examples of diagnosis. So there's nothing I love more than actually coming into a site unseen and then being presented with a case and then having to try and work that out. It's really fascinating, and you never stop learning. Every day is different. So we come in and you see this, a large tree, it's suddenly collapsed, the crown, it's in a golf course. You see normally these trees are really prone to canker, no above ground symptoms, okay? Nothing that's really saying this is why this tree has collapsed suddenly. People would think maybe drought, but it's on a golf course, it's irrigated, okay? So water's probably not playing a major role here. When we dig down around the base of the tree, we see, this tree's got fill over the base, so the root crown and the basal stem's covered in soil. It gets summer irrigation, okay, it's getting that irrigation through summer, and it's had some damage at the base, and so pathogens have come in. So we found Phytophthora and Armillaria, the honey fungus, have come in, and effectively they've decayed and girdled the base of that tree. So then the roots aren't functioning like they should be, the tree goes into summer, the crown requires a certain amount of water, can't get what it needs, and then it collapses. Okay, so determining the cause of that is really important. Okay, and then should we be doing something to try and save the tree? It probably will resprout, but no, because it was on a lean, the tension roots were under decay, and it was deemed too great a risk as well. Okay, so that tree had to be removed. But it's important we know what causes it, so we just go in and plant another seedling in there or a tree, then it can get infected very quickly. Okay, so how we manage that site is really important. We're always discovering new species all the time. Okay, so every year we go out, we isolate, we find, we sequence them, and we find these new species. So there's a couple of examples here. Jarrah's declining. You see the crown declining over time. We did lots of treatments. We had response. They then declined further. So we then destructively sampled a few trees. We sacrificed some sacrificial trees to try and learn what was causing this. So we took the trees down, cut the roots, and took biscuits all the way up the tree, and we actually identified a new species of fungus, this Ophiostoma, Eucalyptogema, which we described a few years ago, causing blue stain in the trunk. Okay, so basically the vascular system was getting blocked up, and it was associated with the beetle as well. So, it made sense as to why those treatments weren't working. We're getting a response, but then effectively it'd start wilting again and die. And this is the famous boab in Kings Park. I don't know if anyone been to Kings Park in Perth at all? Shirma? No? Yeah. This tree is about an 800-year-old boab tree. It was brought down from the north of Australia, 3,500 kilometres on a truck, and relocated and planted in Kings Park. And it's an amazing tree. So it's like a rock star, of trees in Australia. And so the arborist there is always giving talks about this tree, showing people. Anyway, it developed these really interesting symptoms on the side of the tree. We did some work a few years ago to work out what was causing that, and found a whole heap of different fungi and other things, but described a few new species. But one of these was this Graphium jumalu, which we believe was playing a role in this cause of these lesions on the tree. So it's fascinating. You never stop learning and discovering new things. Lots and lots of symptoms. I mean, I could have pages of photos like this, but hail damage on trees, armillaria causing these massive scars. This is a big issue in Perth, causing failure of trees and death of large trees. We see this Quambularia canker in marri and flowering gums, this perennial canker. We see Phytophthora, nutrient disorders. This is a armoured scale, the witch's broom, on some of our native trees, which kills trees. It's an insect, microscopic. Armillaria, the mycelium extending a couple of metres up the tree. So, this is all really important information, because that tree there, if you don't know what you're looking at, it doesn't show particular symptoms outside, it collapses. The contractor comes along, cuts the tree down, mulches it, gives the mulch away for free, beautiful, and gives the disease at the same time. Okay, so it's a really big issue. So we need to know what's causing it to manage it. And here, just really poor nursery stock being planted, eventually dies after several years of fertiliser and water and care and love, and then it dies. So we come along and find that it's never ever going to be a good tree. It's got disease, it's got really poor root system. So it's unsustainable. Okay, this is the sexy stuff, I suppose. This is the remote sensing. Okay, so this is what we've been doing since 2009 in the golf course. So the golf course I showed you before. So basically what we do is we fly over in a fixed-wing plane with a couple of special cameras, and we acquire high-resolution multispectral imagery, about sort of 40 centimetre pixels, so pretty high res. We have another camera that picks up about 7 or 8 centimetres at the same time, just a normal camera. And then we use that imagery, that multispectral imagery, we process it and analyse it in a way where we get an index, a bit like NDVI, and I'm sure people here will know about an index in agriculture. But it's related to the health of vegetation. And if we collect that in the right way, with the right camera, with specific parameters, and we collect it 6 months later or a year later again, we can really precisely look at the change in the vegetation over time. And so that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at change detection. So really what we're looking at is the change in the condition of vegetation over a 12-month period. Okay, so if it's a blue pixel, it's increased in vigour. If it's white, it's stayed about the same. And if it's red, it's gone backwards. Okay, so we're really interested in the red bits, because we want to know where's the vegetation not doing so well, and if it goes backwards, let's go in and look really quickly and see what's causing it. Okay, it's early diagnosis, early warning, because then we've got a greater chance of managing that and bringing that vegetation back. Okay, managing that site more sustainably. So here, actually, trees were removed for a new driveway and driving range that was put in. If you look at this site here, this is a zoom in of that location. So you've got the green, you've got some trees here, and this is a planting of small shrubs like this. Okay, and so you see the blue ones that have grown really well over that 1 year period. Now you see the red ones that have died in that 1 year period. Okay, gone backwards. So then we go in and determine the cause of that. And we found Phytophthora in there, we found poor soil conditions. So again, early warning and early diagnosis. So we've been doing this work in Australian cities since about 2009. This work that we do forms the basis of one of our clients, City of Joondalup, their pathogen management plan. It's done that since 2012. And so we use this to go in and look for pathogens and problems in the urban areas, particularly bushlands and parks. They've got over 300 parks and natural areas. And so these guys, they've won environmental awards around some of this work and other stuff that they do really well. Okay, here's another example. So you're seeing, here's the golf course here, the edge. This is the urban area that surrounds the golf course. So this is all residential here. Well, this is residential here. This actually belongs to the local government, okay? So now you can clearly see, trees, even parts of trees have gone backwards in that time, okay? It won't tell you why they've gone backwards, but it'll tell you where the vegetation's gone backwards, and then it allows us to determine ground truth it, okay? So here you see power lines running down the middle. So there's been pruning here for clearance for power lines. You see palm fronds that have been removed. You see the sudden death of a banksia. You see part of a tulip branch that's died, okay, eucalyptus. So, and you see, if it's a strong red, it's a death or complete loss. If it's a more subtle pink hue, not as strong and intense, it means that it's decline in vigour, but not a lot. Okay, it's gone backwards subtly. Okay, and blue is obviously increase in vigour and vegetation cover. And here's one of the City of Joondalup's sites here, a bushland. It's an incredible spot. Had been diagnosed as having Phytophthora in there, based on indicator species, species that are susceptible. But in fact, when we went in there to look at these areas, we never found it once. Okay, and we reassessed twice. We went in there and never found it. So it wasn't Phytophthora, it was causing the loss of this vegetation. You see what we do, basically a desktop analysis. This is all geospatial, so we look at all the red pixels, we allocate points, and then we load them up onto our tablet and we walk into the field. It's geospatial, every point's a coordinate. We can walk straight to that location and determine what's causing it. The traditional approach with dieback surveys is to have teams of people basically doing transects, okay, and looking for species that are going backwards. But that's really incredibly inefficient, and also you're seeing a snapshot in time. Okay, so when did that vegetation die? How long has it been occurring for? There's all these questions that need to be answered. Here we can determine exactly where, when, and walk straight there. So we go straight there and then we determine the course. So here you see small acacia. We open that up and have a look, and there's a combination of an insect and a fungus in there causing the death. Here we see banksias dropping out. We look at the base of the tree. We see lesions coming up from the base, but not Phytophthora, okay, other pathogens, okay, causing that. So how we manage that site is really determined by what's causing it. And one of our students, Mohammed Baydani, he's from Iraq, and he's about 2.5 years in now to his PhD, looking at Phytophthora associated with declining urban trees in that council alone. And he's found over 40 species of Phytophthora or taxa associated with declining trees. We know in Australia there's over about 90 of them. So many of them we don't really know what they're doing. So we find them, we identify the location, we identify the species, but then the big question obviously the local government wants to know is, fine, we've got these things, how do we manage them? What do we do now? And that's a really important part. So the next phase of his work has been, okay, what is the susceptibility of some of the most common urban trees in Perth to these various Phytophthora species? Okay, and so challenge inoculating and testing the Phytophthora against these hosts, and then determining how susceptible they are. It's really important information, because when you find these things in the landscape, you want to be able to plant back in with species that are not susceptible. Okay, otherwise it's again just unsustainable. You're just wasting your time. And he's also testing some more novel treatments than phosphite to manage Phytophthora. And phosphite's been an incredibly successful chemical around the world. It's a really a good treatment, but there are other treatments that are being developed. Okay, so from the same flyover and acquisition, we process the data in a a slightly different way, and we can actually develop height models from that data. When we develop a height model over the vegetation, we can actually slice through the height model, so we can get these shape files of precisely where all the vegetation is, what height class it belongs to, and what is the area of that. So is everyone cool? This is an example, okay? So the type of imagery that we collect is not just like mapping imagery, okay? So there are lots of companies collecting, really nice high spatial resolution imagery. This is an example here. So we have this type of imagery in Perth and Australia and overseas. But you can see the issues here, okay? So very clear and very high quality. But now look at the lean of some of these buildings, for example. So now you see that this building's leaning in this direction and this building's leaning in this direction, okay? It's partly to do with the type of camera that's used to collect the information. So if you have a camera that has a very wide field of view, sometimes you begin looking at trees almost from side on. You'll see some mapping imagery that you can see trees that almost look like this. You're looking at the trunks as well. That's not good for remote sensing and what we want to do in vegetation, okay? It's a lot of satellite imagery is the same. We collect it in a way so it's always downward looking. So you see an example here, the comparison. So you're always looking straight down on top of the tree. That's really important. And the type of camera used is able to detect the vegetation even in shadows. So you see in the city of Perth, which is our capital city, we were asked to basically map every piece of vegetation in the city as part of the urban forest plan, okay, to measure that as a baseline so they can set targets over time. And now you can see here all that vegetation. So here, everything green is under 3 metres in height, everything yellow is 3 to 10, blue is 10 to 15 metres, and red is above 15 metres in height. Okay, so now we know where the trees are, what height class they're in, we know exactly the areas, and we can determine, we can divide that up into, streets and parks and all those sorts of things as well. And not all this data is the same, okay? So the accuracy of the data is obviously really important because if you're going to have measures, the percentage cover in hectares in your city, you want to make sure they're accurate and they have to be repeatable as well. Okay, you want to know that when you fly over the next year, you're comparing apples with apples, okay? You're going to be able to have a reliable measure compared to your baseline. Okay, and so here's an example. This is in South Australia, which is another area in Australia where we did this work. And now you can see the accuracy and the level of precision of the type of data that we're collecting. So this is all air, it's not drone, okay? Everyone gets very excited about drones. It's not drone. This is across many large square kilometres. It's just not feasible to use drones. And now you see all this vegetation. These are all polygons that go into a GIS, and we have raster data as well. Okay, so every pixel, it has an area. So very precisely we can determine the area of vegetation cover. You can see a comparison. Another company started to do some work in this space using a different type of camera, like a mapping camera, and it had a near-infrared band, and they tried to sort of develop it for vegetation. From a distance it looked great, but when you zoomed in, you could see the blocky nature of it. You could see where cars had been picked up as grass. There's all sorts of misclassifications. Now that's really a concern because if your baseline's not accurate, then how are you going to set proper targets? Okay, so you need to make sure it's accurate. And recently there's been a study done in Australia looking at iTree, which is a model, and it's been really great for raising awareness of the importance of urban trees in the global cities. But it's a model, okay, and it's based on data sets that come in, and it's not really accurate for a lot of the clients that we're working in. So, for example, iTree was used in 2014 to benchmark all the local governments in Australia, which is great. So people sort of got a feeling for where they sat as a council in terms of their canopy cover, and then this year they did a reassessment to determine where they changed over time. And some of those councils that we've been working in were told that their vegetation cover was going backwards 3 or 4% using iTree, but our data actually showed that they hadn't changed at all. Okay, so they had to ring them up and tell them, and then they've had to have clauses put in there to say, in fact, it's not accurate. Okay, it's really important that people understand the difference between model data and real data. Okay. Okay, so here's, I showed you that image earlier, which was zooming out, but here's the Wembley Golf Course, the golf complex. And here you see the town of Cambridge, which is actually a local government area, like a municipality, so they manage all the assets in that council. And now you see part of that golf course, we zoom in, and now you see the vegetation cover stratified into height. Okay, so you see the level of detail, and there's a huge amount of data just sitting there. Okay, I mean, the pictures are pretty and they look cool, but this is the really important stuff. Okay, this is the real data on the actual cover of vegetation classified into height in those areas. Okay, so here we see now in the town of Cambridge, because we're able to differentiate between what's vegetation and what's not, we can get a very quick picture of the amount of hardscape. So areas that aren't covered in vegetation obviously contribute to urban heat and stormwater runoff and all those things that we don't really like. And then you see the difference with the golf course. So here's the proportion in the golf course between here, you see a lot less hard space, a lot of turf, but then quite large areas of cover comparatively in these with big trees. Okay, you see in the town actually small proportion of big tree and big tree cover. So they're really the areas that are providing maximum benefit to people who live in those areas. So Wembley Golf Course is 6.2% of the total area of the town, but in fact it has 11% of the total vegetation cover, and nearly 20% of the trees in there are over 15 metres in height, okay, which is huge. So we see that the golf course is actually really important, and we've got a precise measure of that area. So going from the air down to the ground and talking about managing those trees, it doesn't matter how much of that data you have, and we can tell you, how you're changing over time and where your trees are going backwards and all those things. It doesn't matter unless you do something about it and you do it right on the ground. Okay. So often we're getting called in to diagnose problems in trees. We see an urban street here that the trees, these are claret ash trees that have been dying, for years slowly. Lots of management, lots of love and care and affection given to those trees. And then when we've come in to look at them, we've found that they've been brutalised. We've been butchered at the base here in these soak wells, crazy stuff. And when we've ripped some of the trees out, the replacement trees, the ones that we actually planted to replace the old ones, now we see what's happened in the nursery. Okay, so here you've got, this was the original planting bag. The pot was potted on, then it was put into a bag here and the root system constrained, and there's the remnants of the bag here. And then again, okay, so we're seeing these girdled roots and kinked roots and J-rooting and all sorts of massive issues in the root systems. No wonder the above ground portion is not thriving. Okay, it doesn't matter what we do to the above ground portion and the fertiliser and the water, that's never going to be a great tree. Okay, so we basically just said rip them all out, start again. Okay, it's the most sustainable approach. But if you're going to start again, you need to make sure that you do it right in the nursery. So we've got a really high profile development. We're working on it, been watching the trees growing for several years now. And here you see even the system, the rocket pots that you can grow trees in, which are meant to create great root systems. Again, it doesn't matter what you grow them in. If you don't manage the root system well, you're not going to get a great root system. So here, above ground, the seedlings look great, but the root system's already constrained, okay? Already lignified, going downwards, spiralling downwards. That's partly to do with the way they're grown in the tube stock. Then they're planted on. And again, you see these trees are looking okay above ground, but when you pull them out and actually shake all the fine roots off, now you see what's meant to be a good lateral root system is non-existent. Okay, it's all going downwards. So if you start putting those trees in the landscape and you start putting them on the top of roofs, for example, in structural cells and with ground anchors, there's a real chance that trees like that will just blow over at great cost and risk to people. Okay. So getting this right is so important. And if you find problems in trees, this is an example of some work we did back in 2008 and 2009. This is actually when I was still at the university, and we just did this because we were interested in what was going on. These were lemon-scented gums down a driveway. They'd been planted as advanced trees many years prior. And this incredible, these symptoms were developing on these trees. So we saw these, the bark shedding, we saw the crowns going backwards. You could see this big bark shedding completely off these trees. So we came in and ripped a couple of trees up. We cut them from the root systems up to the top. Actually, Dr. Tu from Vietnam was here visiting me at the time. So the 2 or 3 of us, you just imagine a forest pathologist in there's like a dream for us, really cutting these trees up and looking at them, and found this bark beetle in there and this amazing new species of fungus, which is a bit like the similar ones that I spoke about before. And it was moving root to root contact through these trees. And the previous consultants had said, it's lack of water, you just need to put 300 litres of water a day on these trees, and this thing was just going rampant, So we basically said, look, we can't guarantee we can actually do anything about this, but based on the fungus and the insect and what's going on here, we suggest you treat with these treatments, reduce the water, and we'll see what happens. So we went back, this is just under a year later after those treatments had been applied, and then we saw this before and after change in the trees. So you saw bark that was shedding, completely being walled off by the same tree. The crowns had bounced back. You can see the difference here, the before and after. So it was actually then that I realised and thought, what, I think there's a need for this type of work, and that's where it sort of all began. Yeah. And here, since that time, we've treated thousands of trees now over the years, and just lots and lots of examples. But this is the witch's broom scale in this large tree. So before and after treatment, which was a bit of pruning and systemic treatment. Iron and manganese deficiencies in these trees. Before and after, things like that. So again, I'm always willing to try things. I think if there's a problem, we diagnose the cause. Let's apply treatment and try and save these mature trees, because they're just worth so much to us in the urban landscape, and they're much better than just planting another advanced tree in that space. It's worth a try, and often we have success, which is great. We've learned a lot over the years what does and doesn't work. Okay. In terms of urban heat, and I know that FAO is particularly interested in this space, and it's really important because of the health of people and resilience. We did some work in South Australia for what we call Resilience South, which is a group of 4 local governments, and they developed a plan to build the resilience of communities to climate change. And so this is part of that work. So we basically flew over in a plane. We acquired airborne thermal data across, it's about 285 square kilometres. It's quite a big area. And these were 2 metre pixels. Okay, so quite a high resolution. It was one of the hottest days in summer, so it was about 38.5 degrees that day. And I was running around with a thermal camera on the ground taking photos of different areas with high and low canopy cover to get measurements. We pulled out all the statistics as part of this work, wrote the reports, and some of these images were used in the media and by the council to drive change in how they plan cities. Okay, and so you see this, for example, here's the difference between a low density, older style development suburb. Small houses, bigger blocks, lots of vegetation, white roofs and different coloured roofs in that space. So you see the blue, cooler temperatures alongside a brand new development, high density development. We've got lack of trees, lots of hard space, black roofs. There seem to be a lot of black tile roofs which absorb heat. And here was about a 5 degree difference in surface temperature by mid-morning, around about 10 a.m, 10:30 a.m. in the morning. Okay, so it sort of says to you, where would you rather live? Would you rather live there or here in these new developments? And often the people in the new developments are young families, they're trying to sort of get a house. And so that's not great for people to be living in that space. So instead of creating these big urban heat islands, now they're doing pockets, these little pockets around close to infrastructure to break up that sort of urban heat island effect. And so all our work, what sort of really makes me happy, I suppose, and feel like we're making a difference is that the data and information we provide goes into plans. And because these local governments are managing these green assets and infrastructure, it makes a difference. Whereas when I was at the university and I'd write a lot of papers and things, I'd sort of wonder who was reading my papers. Although the research was really important, and it still is, I really wanted to be making it almost an immediate difference. And And here we're feeding always into these management plans and policies. So I get a lot of satisfaction out of that rather than writing a consultant's report that gathers dust on a shelf somewhere and no one reads it, which some clients obviously do that. So it happens a lot. Finally, just wrapping up, we've been involved in another really exciting study with University of Western Australia and other collaborators, Telethon Health Institute and Heart Foundation and so on. And so using our data, our canopy cover data in the urban area to quantify the cover of vegetation in childcare centres and relate that to the physical activity of children and their exposure to UV. So again, it comes back to those messages, and people want those environments to be healthy for their children, and we've got the data that can be used by people on the ground and measuring other data sets. So it's basically bringing them together. And I, again, get a lot of satisfaction out of that because we know we're making a difference. And although it's obvious that, increased canopy cover should reduce UV exposure and things like that, it needs to be shown, okay? The data needs to be there. So here's an example. You see the vegetation cover data sets, so as I showed you before, but now they're just all the same colour. And here's the childcare centre. So very precisely, we quantify the cover of vegetation and the height class, what produces shade and what doesn't produce shade in that childcare centre. And then we just basically do it across lots of childcare centres. And then these accelerometers and UV meters are attached to lots of children, okay? And so there's a huge amount of data being collected. And then we, it's just good science. You just collect the data sets and obviously do the correlations, and so that's really exciting. So it's expanded now. I think there's probably about 100 childcare centres and growing. And I look forward to when we can really get some concrete papers out of that. We've presented at conferences and things like that. It's been really good. Okay, so take-home message really from me, keeping it pretty simple, I think, is that technology adoption needs to be combined with field experience, and I really feel that that's the key to sustainable urban forest management. Okay, because we can collect all the data we want and all these exciting technologies and run around there and get lots of pretty images, but if we don't know what it means on the ground and we don't understand trees and vegetation, then it's wasted. Okay, so we really need to have that connection. It needs to be, and that's where we found a bit of a niche in that space. We understand trees, we understand the technology. A huge amount of resources can be wasted on remote sensing. Okay, a lot of people, fed information and they spend a lot of money on remote sensing technologies. They go away, they grab them, and then it doesn't tell them what they wanted it to tell them, and then they say it doesn't work. Okay, and it gives the whole remote sensing area a bad name. So I think you must have a good understanding of the advantages and limitations for vegetation. That's really important. Okay, what does and doesn't work for your application, and that must be based on experience, because if you don't have that, then you will waste time and money. Okay, and it happens a lot. Utilising novel technologies will greatly reduce costs and improve efficiencies, and I think I've shown that, and we do that time and time again, because it's a cost-effective approach. It reduces labour on the ground, it's precision, it's targeted, and then it results in targeted management, okay, which is really important. So you can't manage something if you don't know what's causing the problem. You have to know that. And business as usual just doesn't cut it. I'm sorry, the old way of doing things in the space we're in now with disruptive technologies and AI and machine learning and all these things that are happening, we just have to keep moving forward. It's an exciting space, and I look forward to seeing where it is in the next 10 years. The stuff I'm presenting now will just be old school, 10 years time. Let's not reinvent the wheel and research what is already known, okay? So often we'll present some of that work and the people say, oh, it's research. It's not research, it's been happening for years, okay? So it's really important that we target our research in really cutting edge areas. And finally, the resilience and well-being of our communities is directly linked to our urban forests and open spaces, and I believe we all have a responsibility in our areas of expertise to help that. Okay, so yeah. So thanks very much, and thanks for coming along today and not falling asleep. It's good. I saw a couple of people falling after lunch.